Ask any teacher, marketer, politician, journalist, or photographer. The story is everything. I mean, if you're like most people, you love a good story, don't you? You read them, tell them, watch them all the time. But really, why do they move us so much? Why do stories matter? What's the big deal? I mean, a story is just a story, right? It's just an experience that happens to have happened. Or maybe in some cases it didn't happen at all. I mean, some are not even true. They're just created from the imagination of an author or screenwriter. Of course, if Spielberg produces it, it might get an Oscar. But when you collect stories over time, something incredible happens. They stimulate the imagination of a child. That's why kids need different kinds of stories over time. For example, kids need family stories over time. Without personal and family stories, kids miss out on having the kind of relational history that fuels a healthy perspective about their identity. Kids need cultural stories over time. Cultural stories help stimulate a kid's imagination and shapes their understanding of a bigger world. Without these kind of stories, kids could miss part of the cultural history they need to develop values and empathy for the people around them. By the way, cultural stories includes fiction. That's those stories that never happened. I actually think God is okay with fiction. Now, that may sound strange, but the reason I believe that is because there's actually some fiction in the Bible. No, I'm not saying the Bible is fiction. I'm saying the Bible is true, but fiction was the primary way Jesus amplified truth. Don't forget, he taught in parables because sometimes the best way to clarify truth is to tell a story. So, kids need family stories, cultural stories, and kids need Bible stories over time. We decided to put this at the bottom of our list for a reason, not because it's less important, but actually because it's more important. Because the Bible isn't a book, it's actually a library of 66 books written by 40 different authors over 1,600 plus years. They were all very different people, ranging from nomads to kings, from priests to fishermen. Yet all of the stories of the Bible connect to tell one story about God and His love for us through time. Without the Bible, kids and teenagers could grow up and fail to connect the great mysteries of the universe with a creative and loving God. They would miss out on the kind of spiritual history that's foundational to faith. But that's why stories over time matter. They provide kids with a relational, cultural, and spiritual context to shape their perspectives about God, faith, values, and life. Stories over time expand a child's imagination in a way that can shape his or her perspective. So what does that have to do with you? As leaders and parents, you are the storytellers. You're the producers. You're the librarians, or maybe even the photojournalists. You should always be looking for the next story because that's the best way you can help kids have a richer history. By the way, have you ever considered that stories are just another one of God's brilliant ideas? I mean, if God created time as a platform to prove He loves us unconditionally, then maybe He designed stories so that collectively, over time, they could give us a deeper perspective about His universal principles and truths. To put it another way, God fashioned the human brain so it would connect to story. Then He crafted an original script that would continue to fascinate humans. Then He designed humans with the creative talent to craft intriguing stories. It's like our minds are hardwired to engage in the way that information fits together in the context of a narrative. One specialist in this area puts it this way. He says, in the last 15 years, we have developed the brain imaging technologies that help us shed light on what it means to get lost in a good story. Studies are suggesting that when reading, listening, or watching a good story, we activate brain regions used to process the experience as if it were our own. In other words, we are wired for stories. So, if you ever need a little more proof that God exists, consider the magical, mystical, imaginative, compelling way kids, teenagers, and everyone else for that matter, connect to stories. Seems obvious. God created your imagination, and then God invented stories to ignite it. Just don't underestimate the potential of your God-given imagination. Have you ever considered that without imagination, you can't see past what you already know? You can't care how someone else feels? And you can't even hope beyond your present situation? J.K. Rowling says some interesting things about humans and imagination. She suggests that we are the only species that can think ourselves into other people's places. That's what the gift of imagination and story does for a child or teenager. It enables them to think their way into other people's lives. It compels them to feel the sentiments of other people's emotions. It invites them to venture into other people's places. Maybe that's why research actually indicates that the more stories you read to a child over time, the greater their empathy. Because stories have the potential to make you feel what someone else feels. Stories over time can collectively work to build a child's emotional, relational, and moral intelligence. I mean, just think about what happens when a child imagines fighting Smaug the dragon with Bilbo on the Lonely Mountain, joining Anne-Marie in the Danish resistance during World War II, traveling with Lucy through a mysterious wardrobe into a frozen land. They see more, they care more, they hope more. That's what imagination does. It affects our emotions, it affects our intuition. Imagination also affects our faith. Have you ever considered that maybe God gave us our imaginations so we can imagine things about Him that we have not seen or cannot see? This is so important. This is why you should foster imaginations within children. It helps them see beyond themselves. It helps them embrace complex truths. It helps them envision realities related to ancient stories of faith. You need to encourage a child's imagination if you ever want them to be able to imagine the power of what happened when God created the world. If you ever want them to imagine the voice of God to Moses from a burning bush, or the miracles Jesus performed as He traveled through the ancient cities, the majesty of a heavenly dwelling place, don't miss this. God gave us imagination so we could imagine the unimaginable. Stories are the spark that ignite our creative senses and emotions. Stories move us, and stories have the potential to stretch our perspectives about God. By the way, this is the reason that Jesus was such a master at spinning parables to teach people about the character of God. He was God. So you can imagine the creator of the cerebrum, the very one who fashioned your imagination to connect a story, crafting a story to actually tell you. I mean, that kind of gives him an advantage over the average storyteller, don't you think? Maybe that's why his stories were so timeless, so powerful, and so life-changing. Jesus appealed to our imaginations and even invited us into the action. As leaders and parents, we would be smart to do the same. The stories you tell matter. You're inviting kids and teenagers into a bigger narrative, one where they have been designed to play a significant role. Why do you think Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, Frodo in Lord of the Rings, Aslan in the Chronicles of Narnia, and a boy named Harry have such an appeal to the hearts of kids? Because they remind us. They remind us of the struggle between good and evil. They remind us of the existence of a supernatural and miraculous power, the potential to be personally restored and transformed. Why do you think the same themes are recycled so many times? Maybe it's simply because the idea of story originated with God. If every story was written by an author who is created in God's image, then doesn't it make sense that their stories are in some ways a reflection of His story? No wonder stories inspire us. No wonder stories incite faith. No wonder stories give us hope. And isn't that the kind of perspective you want kids and teenagers to have about this world? Don't you want them to know that life's connected to a bigger story where God is the author? A bigger story perspective, it prepares them to face whatever happens. It compels them to take risks, to do something significant, and it moves them to keep believing that good will ultimately win. That's why everybody loves a good story. You latch onto someone who's going against the odds. You identify with their struggle to push through. Did you know the script for Harry Potter was written during J.K. Rowling's darkest hour? Here's how she describes that time in her life. An exceptionally short-lived marriage had imploded, and I was jobless, a lone parent, and as poor as it is possible to be in modern Britain without being homeless. I was the biggest failure I knew. I was set free because my greatest fear had been realized. I was still alive, and I still had a daughter whom I adored, and I had an old typewriter and a big idea. And so rock bottom became the solid foundation on which I rebuilt my life. So Rowling captured the imagination of a generation with a story. The story of a boy named Harry, an unusual boy, marked for a specific destiny from birth. As he discovered his true identity and embraced his purpose, he grew in wisdom and strength. His closest friends followed him everywhere, facing grave opposition, but they could not always understand what he understood. They could not follow him into the very final battle against an evil enemy where he entered into death itself and defeated it. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Regardless of what you think about Harry, you have to agree, stories are powerful, especially when they reflect God's story. So playing for keeps means you get serious about giving kids stories over time. That means you look for opportunities to amplify the story every week. When you amplify the story, you do whatever you can to find more stories to inspire kids and teenagers. Because as parents and leaders, when you amplify the story, you're giving them a bigger story perspective about life. So read them, watch them, tell them, create them, write them, illustrate them, film them, live them, collect them. It's stories that will give them history, that will transform their perspective. It's stories that will make their life fuller, make their faith deeper, and make their hope stronger. Stories over time move us to imagine a world beyond ourselves.